All right. So let's go ahead and take a look at the election of 1948. And I got to tell you, you're a lucky, lucky class because the election of 1948 is my favorite presidential election. I really love this one. I think it's a very interesting election. So the Democrats, they meet in Philadelphia in 1948. And it's by no means a sure thing that Truman's going to be renominated by his party. I mean, there's a lot of people in the party that are lukewarm on him at best. And a lot of the Democrats were trying to court the war hero Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower never discussed politics. I mean, that is to say, he never gave any indication of what party he belonged to during the war. And so people just aren't sure within the Democratic Party if they want to have Truman nominated. However, it surprises a lot of people when on the first ballot Truman is nominated by his party. Now the Democratic platform, it causes a major split within the party at this time because the Democratic platform, they're beginning to address racism. They're beginning to address a lot of these problems that are happening with African Americans, with Native Americans, and other minority groups. And they begin to say, we need to work to improve these relations. Well, as you can imagine, the Democratic Party, its base, a very strong pillar of its base is in the South, right? The South had been very pro-democratic. Remember, they still hate Republicans because of the Civil War. So many Southern delegates to the Democratic Party walk out. They leave. They're not happy with the direction the party's going because it's trying to kind of curb racism. Now, the platform of the Democrats also call for things like, they do call for the recognition of the State of Israel, which had been recently formed. I believe it declared its independence in May of '48. They called for an increase in the minimum wage. The Republicans, they also meet in Philadelphia, and they nominate a fellow by the name of Thomas E. Dewey from New York. Thomas E. Dewey. And the Republicans, they call for an extension of Social Security benefits. They're also calling for civil rights legislation, and they're calling for a crackdown on communist influence in the United States. We're already starting to see this kind of McCarthyism we'll address later, and they're saying we got to get rid of these communists. Now, critically too, they're also calling the Republicans are also calling for recognition of Israel. Now, here's the thing about this race, and this is one of the reasons why this race is so interesting. Everybody expects Dewey to win this race. Everybody thinks that Thomas Dewey is a shoo-in. Truman does not have is not going to win. And the reason why is because one of those Southern delegates that walked out of the Democratic Party was Strom Thurmond. And Strom Thurmond was, I believe he was from South Carolina. And he is one of these, at this time, he's an unrepentant segregationist and Jim Crow guy. And they call his party, I can't remember I can't remember the actual name of the party, but they called them the Dixiecrats, the Dixiecrat Party. Well, the Dixiecrat Party was expected to sweep the South and would split the Democrats, right? Just like we saw with Taft and Roosevelt in 1912. It was expected that Strom Thurmond would split the vote here. Dewey would win because he'd have solid Republican support. Well, there was I think it was like a Time magazine poll. They asked like 50 talking heads who was going to win and why. And 50 out of 50 said that Dewey was going to win because the Democratic vote was split. Truman wasn't popular. Everybody was convinced that was going to happen. And Truman didn't have any money. Truman, if you got on Dewey's train, if you were a reporter on Dewey's train, they'd have porters take your baggage. You had a really nice place. You had food on the train. If you got on Truman's train, you were covering Truman, you had to carry your own baggage. There wasn't any food, cramped quarters. But critically, Truman would go back and he'd talk to reporters on the train. Dewey wouldn't do that. Dewey's whole position is, I'm going to win this thing. I just don't want to say anything that's going to screw it up. So consequently, he makes a lot of speeches that say things like, our future is ahead of us. Our seas are filled with fish. Real controversial stuff, right? And Truman, there was one anecdote where Truman, in the middle of the night, his train, he's like in rural, I want to say like Iowa or something, I can't remember where it was, but he's in the middle of the country, and his train stops. And of course, he and his guys get out and go talk to the engineer. What's the matter with the train? The engineer said, well, there's nothing wrong with the train. I haven't been paid in 2 weeks, and the train's not moving until you pay me. So Truman and his guys, they walk like about a mile to the next town, and while they're there in the next town, they have this kind of impromptu fundraiser. They get people to donate money. They go back to the engineer, they pay him, and the train gets moving again. So that was kind of an amusing anecdote. Now, so everyone's expecting Dewey to win this and to win this pretty handily. Well, about a month before the election, pollsters actually stopped polling people. They said, what's the point? We all know Dewey's going to win. And, of course, it's not like today where we know the results of a poll, virtually instantly. It would usually take about 2 weeks to collate the results of the poll. And so what they miss is that Truman is actually really connecting with rural voters. He's really connecting with farmers around the country. And more farmers like what he has to say here. And so it kind of just completely amazes everybody when on election night, and it was into the next morning, I believe, when the results are finally tallied, Truman wins the election, 303 electoral votes to Dewey's 189, and Strom Thurmond got 39 votes. So it's kind of one of those remarkable things there. Now, during Truman's second term, we will also have the passage of the Second Amendment was ratified, which limited the president to 2 terms. It's 2 terms or a total of 10 years. So in theory, if a vice president becomes president within the first couple of years of a term, he could only run once. He couldn't run twice. So that's kind of, the Republicans, of course, were really behind that. They didn't want to see another Franklin Roosevelt. They didn't want to see, somebody run 4 terms, right? All right, now we're going to see 4 things. So I'm talking now about the Cold War once again. We're going to see 4 things that really begin to heat up the Cold War in a big way here in the late 1940s. In fact, between 1949 and 1950, we're going to have these 4 things that really significantly heat up the Cold War. Now, the first thing happens in August of 1949. In August of 1949, American spy planes detect in Siberia an atomic explosion. The Soviets have the atomic bomb in 1949. Now, we had created it in 1945. They've got it in 1949. Our experts said the Soviets would not have an atomic bomb until 1954. That was our best estimate. We said they will not have it until 1954. And they've got it 5 years early. And as you can imagine, this scares people. Truman, goes on the radio and he says, we no longer have an atomic monopoly. And so now, from this point forward, Americans have to live with the possibility that they might be attacked by a foreign nation with an atomic bomb. Now, and I'll explain kind of how that happens here in a minute. But the second thing that occurs in 1949, in October of 1949, the Chinese communists win their civil war. So the Chinese communists have been trying to take power since the 1920s. There'd been a small communist movement in China, and it had grown. Now, during the 1930s, when the Japanese invade China, there was almost kind of a 3-way war between the Chinese nationalists on one end, the Chinese communists on another, and the Japanese on the other. And the communists actually were much more effective in fighting the Japanese than the nationalist government was, because the nationalist government was incredibly corrupt. And after World War II, after the Japanese are defeated, after the Japanese are defeated, the communists then kind of pursue this civil war against the nationalist government. Well, the leader of the Chinese communists, Mao Zedong, he eventually is able to defeat the nationalist government. The nationalist government flees to Taiwan, which will be important, as we will see later on. The United States had actively supported Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist government against Mao Zedong. We pumped about $2 billion into this war against the communists, but the communists still won because a lot of that money that we pumped in there and goods that we pumped in there kind of found their way into the pockets of a lot of these corrupt officials. So the communists win. 600 million people in China are now communists. The most populous nation on earth is now a communist nation. And this kind of seems to confirm for Americans that communism is spreading. Communism is spreading, and it's scaring people. Again, because communists are not nice people. They are murderers, and it's an ideology of terror. And now, like I say, China has subscribed to it. Now, the third thing that heats up the Cold War here, and this is really the reason why the Soviets get the atomic bomb when they do, and that is that a number of Soviet spies are detected in the United States, in Canada, and other Western countries. That year, 1950, the FBI arrested Klaus Fuchs. Klaus Fuchs was a German refugee who had worked on the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb project, and he had passed on atomic secrets to the Soviets. You have David Greenglass, who had worked on the Manhattan Project. He was also arrested as a Soviet spy. And Greenglass, his brother-in-law and sister were Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were kind of ringleaders in this operation here. Fuchs will spend about 9 years in a British prison. Greenglass will spend about 10 years in prison. And I think, if memory serves, I think Greenglass testified against his sister. But the Rosenbergs, they actually were executed. They were sent to the electric chair for selling these atomic secrets. And so this idea of we've got these spies now in the American government and they're actively working against us, which were not unfounded fears, that further heightens tensions here. Now, the fourth reason that the Cold War heats up here is something that happens in June of 1950. In June of 1950, North Korea invades South Korea, starting the Korean War. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Korean War here. Actually, just to reiterate, before we go in depth into the Korean War, I'm just going to repeat these things once again because they're important. 4 things that heat up the Cold War. The Soviets test their first atomic bomb. We find Soviet spies throughout the West. The communists, or the Chinese, go communist, and then the communist North Koreans invade South Korea. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look here. Now, we've got 2 leaders in the Koreas. In North Korea, you have a Korean communist named Kim Il-sung. Now, what had happened was Korea had been a kind of a province of Japan for many years, many decades. Korea had been part of Japan, and the Japanese treated the Koreans horribly, horribly. Right at the end of the war, at the end of World War II, the Soviets had come into the war. They declared war on Japan. And so the question was, well, what do we do with Korea? Who do the Japanese in Korea surrender to? And the Soviets were right on the doorstep of Korea. And so Dean Rusk, who will later be the Secretary of State under Kennedy, he actually was a Far East expert in the Pentagon, and he just kind of drew a line through the middle of Korea, said, okay, forces above this line will surrender to the Soviets, forces beneath that line will surrender to the Americans, and kind of the same thing in Germany. Once the Americans and Soviets get there, they don't want to leave. So they each kind of grab their own kind of puppet leader to run their respective camps. And in the north, the Soviets find a Korean communist named Kim Il-sung. And Kim Il-sung, who is the grandfather of the current leader of North Korea. It's a hereditary communist state. Kim Il-sung, of course, is a communist puppet here. In the south, in Korea, the Americans put their own kind of puppet in power. His name was Syngman Rhee. Syngman Rhee actually was a Western-educated politician. He had gone to Princeton, and while he was at Princeton, he actually developed a close friendship with his history professor, Woodrow Wilson. Well, both Ri and Kim want to invade the other side. The North wants to invade the South, South wants to invade the North. They both think they can do it pretty easily. So they both go back to their respective patrons. You know, Kim goes to Stalin, Ri goes to Truman. They say, "Let me do it. Let me invade. Let me take over. We can do it. We can take him out." And both Stalin and Truman say no. Everybody's eyes right now is fixed on Berlin. Berlin's the epicenter of the Cold War. If another war starts, it's going to be over Berlin. That's where we're looking. Nobody's looking at Korea. Nobody's looking at the Pacific. No one cares. They say just keep the status quo as it is, and everybody's happy. But then something kind of interesting happens. And this is kind of one of those stories that some people put greater weight to it or lesser weight to it. I kind of think there's a little ring of truth here. But in January of 1950, we have the Secretary of State. His name was Dean Acheson. And in the spring of 1950, January of 1950 rather, he gives a speech before the National Press Club. And this is called the Defense Perimeter Speech. And in this speech, he essentially says, these are all of the countries in the Pacific that the United States will defend, that we have an interest in, that we will defend. And of course, he lists, French Indochina, Taiwan, Japan. He mentions all these states, and he literally forgets to mention South Korea. He literally forgets to mention South Korea. Well, Kim sees this, and he says, the Americans are sending us a message. They're saying that if we invade South Korea, they won't fight for it. So Kim goes back to Stalin, and he says, look, we've got this message from the Americans. They're not going to fight for South Korea. Let's invade. And Stalin kind of says, you might be right, so he finally gives the green light to do it. And then, of course, we have communist China. China becomes communist in October 1949. So Kim is very emboldened, right? And he's kind of got the attitude, well, not only do the Soviets have our back, but the Chinese communists will as well. So on June 25th, 1950, kind of in a bid to unify Korea under communist leadership, North Korean army moves south swiftly. And very quickly, they take over virtually all of the South Korean peninsula. Now, again, these are communists, and life is very cheap for communists. As this communist army is marching south, they find ROK, Republic of Korea army units, South Korean army units, and sometimes Americans that were there, and they just execute them. They're not taking a lot of prisoners. They're just blowing people away. And the United States 8th Army was on occupation duty in Japan, and these guys are fat and happy on occupation duty. And suddenly, Truman authorizes them to just go to Korea and fight and to do the best they can. But the South Korean Army and the U.S. Army are largely outnumbered by the North Korean troops that are coming in. And as I say, the North Koreans take over virtually all of South Korea except for a tiny little corner in the southeast of the peninsula around the city of Pusan. And so this is known as the Pusan Perimeter. The Pusan Perimeter. It's just this little tiny corner of Korea, and the Americans are trying to kind of hold this line to keep them from being completely ejected from Korea. Now, Truman, he goes to the UN, and Truman says, we need to help the South Koreans. And so the UN agrees to launch a police action against the army of North Korea. Now, you may be thinking, but wait a second. Soviets, Chinese are on the Security Council. Why didn't they veto it? We talked about the UN and their veto power. Well, first of all, the UN does not recognize the communist Chinese as the legitimate government of China. It recognizes the nationalist government, which is on Taiwan. I said that was going to be important. So, of course, they're our friends. They're not going to veto it. Why didn't the Soviets veto it? And the answer is because the UN was recognizing the Taiwanese and not the Chinese communists, the Russians were boycotting the UN. They weren't participating in the UN, so they weren't there to veto it. So because they weren't there, we get this through, and this agreement to essentially use military force to fight the North Koreans. Now, incidentally, when Truman first initially dispatched armed forces to Korea, that was not without congressional approval. The Congress did not approve that. They certainly didn't declare war. So this is kind of a gray area. And that's actually going to be the last time a president uses military force on this scale without any kind of a green light from Congress until Barack Obama will do something similar in Libya when we back up British and French forces in Libya. 2011, I think. By September, we have tank units from San Francisco were dispatched. There were about 500 tanks that were in the Pusan perimeter. And gradually, after kind of wearing down the North Koreans and putting our own guys, we start to build up and we start to have more forces there. And now it's time to counterattack. Now, the UN, the commander of the UN forces and the American general is a hero from World War II. This is General Douglas MacArthur. And we didn't talk too much about MacArthur during World War II. But Douglas MacArthur had kind of led the army in the Pacific during the Second World War. Now, instead of just attacking out from the Pusan perimeter and moving up, MacArthur comes up with a pretty decent strategy. You know, I'm kind of lukewarm on MacArthur as a strategist. He had some good moments, to be sure, but I'm kind of lukewarm on him. But I think he has a moment of brilliance here. And his idea is, well, instead of just attacking down here, why don't we do what we did in World War II, launch an amphibious operation and attack up here, behind the lines, and kind of surround them. And everybody says this isn't going to work. They say, you know, where you want to land, the beaches aren't good, you're going to be cut off, it's not a good idea. But he launches this attack near Incheon. And Incheon was the port of Seoul, and attack is tremendously successful. But here's the problem. MacArthur's plan originally called for the landing at Incheon, and then he was going to move all the way across the peninsula, trapping the North Korean army in the south. Instead, what he does is, before he goes across the peninsula, he decides he's going to take Seoul. And he invests too much time taking Seoul, and that gives the bulk of the North Korean forces time to escape. And so the bulk of the UN, or the North Korean forces, get out of Korea there, out of South Korea into the north. So now we have something very interesting happens. The UN forces under MacArthur and the South Koreans, they invade the north. And just like before, where the North Koreans had invaded and captured most of South Korea, now the UN is going to capture most of North Korea. But most people tell MacArthur, don't go all the way to the Yalu River, which was the border between North Korea and China. They say, we don't know what the Chinese are going to do. We have no idea what the Chinese will do. Don't go all the way to the border. And he says, we don't need to worry about the Chinese. We've got the atomic bomb. They're too scared to get involved, so they'll never come in. They'll never come in. Well, in November, the Chinese start sending forces. They start attacking, and of course, as soon as they do that, MacArthur turns around and said, well, this is something I always warned you about. Trying to play both sides there. MacArthur says, okay, the Chinese are in here. I need the president to release to me operational use of tactical nuclear weapons. And, of course, Truman, who understood the implications of dropping a bomb better than any person who has ever lived before or since, he said, no, the president, and only the president, will decide when atomic weapons are used, not military commanders. Well, MacArthur begins to publicly criticize Truman, and the two really don't get along very well. The two just start butting heads. And MacArthur, you know, one thing is a sitting general cannot criticize the civilian government. You can't. That strikes the very heart of Republican government. In fact, Truman went to the library, or had someone go to the library, and he bought books about how Lincoln dealt with McClellan. McClellan was this troublesome general. In fact, there was a story that Lincoln went to see McClellan. McClellan wouldn't talk to him, and Lincoln wanted to know what's going on. And so Lincoln went to his house in Washington. McClellan wasn't there. His wife said, well, if you want to wait for him, you can wait for him. About an hour later, McClellan came home, and his wife said, well, the president's waiting to talk to you in the parlor. And he said, well, I'm too tired. I'm going to go take a nap. So he went up and he slept for about 3 hours. When he came back down, Lincoln was still there, and finally discussed it with him. And I think it was Secretary Seward or said something. Why are you putting up with that? Why are you putting up with that? And he said, I need him. I need this guy. He fights. So Lincoln, I mean, one of the great things about Lincoln's character, he humbled himself because he thought it was in the best interests of the country. Well, now Truman has this troublesome general. And just as another aside, too, we saw, again, I think 2011, 9, we had Stanley McChrystal, who made some indiscreet remarks about Barack Obama in Rolling Stone, and Obama fired him, and he was right to. You cannot have military personnel criticizing civilian government. If you have a problem with policy, if you have a problem with a politician, you resign, and then you make your case. But while you are serving, you cannot criticize civilian government. Not publicly. That's a road to military dictatorship. But that's where it starts, right? So Truman's putting up with MacArthur. He does not like this guy. MacArthur doesn't like him. But the thing of it is, MacArthur's very popular. He's got a lot of people that love him. They think of him as the great general of World War II. But finally, Truman had enough. And in April of 1951, Truman fires MacArthur. He fires MacArthur. They bring in other generals. Eventually, I think Mark Clark's going to come in. Matthew Ridgway became kind of the field commander on the scene. MacArthur rarely actually went to Korea. He was pretty much running the war from Japan. But soon after, in 1951, we have peace talks begin between the UN forces and the Chinese North Korean governments. Now, the Chinese actually came back down and forced us back to about where we started, about the middle of the country. And the lines pretty much stay around the middle of the country for the remainder of the next 2 years. We don't have peace until 1953. In fact, in March of 1953, Stalin died, and the members of the Politburo who are now running the Soviet Union kind of say to the North Koreans, okay, we need to wrap this up, we need to wind this up. So eventually a permanently demilitarized zone was created, a neutral zone, a de facto border, and of course we just saw here as a year or two ago Trump went to Korea. I never thought I'd see a president actually visit North Korea, but Trump did. And it looks like, at least in theory now, the war is over. But that war had lasted since 1950. It never ended. It was a ceasefire, an extended ceasefire. And then I think it was just last year or the year before they actually signed, a peace. There's still plenty of tension there, and I wouldn't bet on it not flaring up again. But in theory now, at least the war is over. During the war, the United States lost 53,000 men. The total UN South Korean deaths from the war, mostly South Koreans, lie between 1.2 and 1.8 million people. Total North Korean, Chinese, Soviet deaths amounted to between 1.8 million and 3.8 million. 1.8 and 3.8 million. Now, I should say the Soviets didn't actually send in soldiers that fought, but you did have some Soviet pilots flying MiGs against American fighter pilots during that war. All right, so that is the Cold War begins. I don't know if we're going to do another one of these, if we're going to be meeting in person yet. Hopefully I'll get that information all to you, but we'll look at our next unit, which is kind of the 1950s, prosperity and fear. So we'll take a look at that next time. Okay, bye-bye. If you have any questions, email me directly.